This begins our first class in the United Kingdom class, and I just want to say at the outset that if you did not get a text or an email that gives you a link to access the material online for this class, contact me by either of those methods and I will see that you get that link. There's also should be plenty of the lesson sheets packets at the on the front pew of the church building if you'd like a hard copy. There's a lot of material to cover, a lot of questions, and I got a lot of stuff here, and I'm choosing not to read the text at the beginning of each section. I'll try to remember. I've got notes to that effect. I'll try to remember to pause for a few moments. You can pause whatever it is you're watching or listening to, whether you're on the audio version on our website or the video version on YouTube. Just hit the stop button if you feel that you would like to read the text before we start into the questions. I'll remind you of that particular section when we get there. Again, I'll try to. Um, I'll I'll simply use the questions as a format and go through them and offer some thoughts that hopefully will be helpful as we work together in this unorthodox arrangement and trying to encourage one another. I'm going to begin with some preliminaries here to bring us up to speed to where we are. This class begins about 1,000 years after the time of Abraham. Abraham lived around 2,000 years before Christ. Moses receiving the Ten Commandments was probably around 1450 BC. Joshua conquered the land of Canaan, and then we had about 300 years of Judges in the book of Judges just prior to where we are beginning in 1 Samuel. The time frame we're covering in this class is around 1100 to 930 BC, a period of about 170 years. Covers the period basically from Samuel's birth to the death of Solomon. Covers the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel and the first 11 chapters of 1st Kings. Four major characters will be Samuel after Eli, but Samuel, Saul, David, and Solomon. To see where we are geographically, the first verse of chapter 1 says there was a certain man of Ramathaim Zophim of the mountains of Ephraim, and his name was Elkanah, the son of Jehoram, the son of Elihu, son of Tohu, son of Zuph, an Ephraimite. Ramathaim Zophim, that's what my translation says. The more modern translations say Rama or Rama. It's uncertain. You can see it on the map there. It's really uncertain from what I've read as to exactly where this particular Rama is. I've read that there are as many as 5 places by that name in and around that area. And so estimates range from anywhere from 5 miles to 15 miles from Jerusalem, and Shiloh was like 20 miles north of Jerusalem. You don't see Jerusalem on the map there, it's just south of Ramah. And so Shiloh is where the tabernacle was located at this time, and Shiloh was about 20 miles north of Jerusalem. Question number 1. I'll go ahead and pause for a second, and if you want to read the entirety of chapter 1, 28 verses there, you can go ahead and do that now. Question number 1 says, even though in a civil sense he was an Ephraimite, of what tribe was Elkanah and his son Samuel by birth and descent? And it gives a reference to 1 Chronicles chapter 6 there, verses 26, 27, and 33 through 35. The first portion of 1 Chronicles chapter 6 covers the family of Levi. That whole section discusses the Levites. In fact, Samuel and his father were Levites. And of course this helps us, so Samuel was a priest. And this helps us to understand passages later. For example, in chapter 10 we have Samuel offering sacrifice. Chapter 13 is where Saul actually offers a sacrifice. He's waiting for Samuel to come because of the imminent battle against the Philistines, and Samuel doesn't show up in time. And you might wonder, if you flip back to this reference and you see that they're Ephraimites, wonder why Samuel is able to offer sacrifices. That's where the confusion arises. We recall that the Levites were not given a specific tribal territory. Instead, they lived among the other tribes. So you could be of the tribe of Levi but be identified as an Ephraimite because you lived in the territory of Ephraim. Question number 2 says, describe Elkanah's family. And then how is this passage a demonstration of the evil consequences of polygamy? Verse 2 says that he had 2 wives. The name of one was Hannah, the name of the other was Peninnah. Peninnah had children, but Hannah had no children. It's not told how many children Peninnah had, but that was certainly a cause of the rivalry here, and that's some of the evil consequences of polygamy, was jealousy, competition, cruelty, rivalry. That's brought out in verses 6 and 7, where it says her rival, Hannah's rival, from verse 5, speaking of Peninnah, provoked Hannah severely to make her miserable because the Lord had closed her womb, so Hannah didn't have children. So it was year by year after when she went up to the house of the Lord, that she provoked her. Peninnah provoked Hannah. Therefore Hannah wept and did not eat. Question number 3 says, why did Elkanah's family go to Shiloh every year? And it gives us 3 references there. I'll just read the reference in Deuteronomy chapter 16 and verse 16 says, 3 times a year all your men, so every Hebrew adult male, must appear before the Lord your God at the place he will choose. And of course that was written before they entered the land, and the place that he chose at this time would be Shiloh. And they said, at the place he will choose at the festival of unleavened bread, the festival of weeks, and the festival of tabernacles. So there were 3 festivals every year that all Israelite men were to attend, to go and observe these 3 great feasts. Most people presume this is the Feast of Tabernacles. It's uncertain. Question number 4 says, why was Hannah sad? Well, we realize that barrenness was considered the ultimate tragedy for a married woman. She was childless. We see problems regarding this issue, rivalry as well with Sarah, Abraham's wife, Sarah, Sarai, and Hagar. We saw it with Rachel and Leah. We see the shame that seems to be associated with that in the New Testament with Elizabeth, the wife of Zechariah, in Luke chapter 1. Question number 5 says, describe Hannah's prayer, found in verses 9 through 18. How was her prayer answered? Verse 10 says, for example, she was in bitterness of soul and prayed to the Lord and wept in anguish. It was a heartfelt prayer. It was a mournful prayer. It was a prayer where she desired a child. And her prayer was answered in verse 20 when we see that in the process of time Hannah conceived and bore a son. Question number 6 asks, what was Hannah's vow and how did she fulfill it? Well, the vow was simply that she would give her child to the Lord for life, and that no razor would touch his head. This is understood to be the Nazirite vow, which was a bit unusual because usually the Nazirite vow was done by the person themselves and not done by proxy, not done by somebody else. Also, as I understand, the vow was for a limited period of time. In Numbers chapter 6, verses 1 through 8, where the Nazirite vow is described and discussed, there are some half dozen times in those 8 verses where it mentions the days of his separation, usually a period of weeks or months from what I understand. and yet this was a lifelong commitment given by his mother. How did she fulfill this vow? Why, she fulfilled it by bringing him to the tabernacle to live, by giving him to the Lord's service. Chapter 2, verses 1 through 10, the Song of Hannah. We'll pause and let you do that reading. Question number 7 says, while pouring out the feelings of her heart as she dedicates her son, what emotions does Hannah express? Well, we might say the theme of this song is the sovereignty and the providential rule of God in every aspect of life. Hannah clearly expressed joy. She expressed exultation and praise of God. She expressed confidence. She expressed thanksgiving. She acknowledged God's salvation in verse 1. She acknowledged his holiness in verse 2, his knowledge in verse 3, his grace in verse 8, his judgment in verse 10. It's interesting to note there's a lot of similarities in the Song of Mary in Luke chapter 1 with the Song of Hannah here. Question number 8 says, how does this prayer differ from her prayer in chapter 1? Well, you recall the first chapter, her prayer was full of sorrow, of longing and desire for a child, whereas this one is full of exultation and victory, if you will, and praise. Chapter 2, verses 11 through 36 will be the next reading. If you'd like to pause and read that, it will be on this section called Judgment on the House of Eli, starting with question number 9. Question number 9 says, what were the sins of Eli's sons? Well, they're called corrupt in verse 12 of chapter 2. The word there is Belial, which means one without value. The particular sins identified, particular sin identified in chapter 2, verses 12 through 17 would be clearly disregard for the law of God, for the sacrifices and the whole worship service. Another sin is identified in verse 22 of this chapter, which would be sexual immorality. I don't think I'm keeping up with my PowerPoint here. Well, that got ahead of myself. Okay. No, it didn't. There's her presenting the child Eli. Sorry if these seem cartoonish. They're the best that I could find, just something as a visual reinforcement. Question number 10 says, describe the progress of Samuel in contrast to the sons of Eli. That is an interesting statement, an interesting thing to consider. When you look in verse 11, we're told of chapter 2 that Elkanah went to his house at Ramah, but the child ministered to the Lord before Eli the priest. And immediately following that, we have the corrupt behavior of Eli's sons in verses 12 through 17. Then in verse 18, we see that Samuel ministered, it says, but, my translation does, verse 18, but, in contrast to Eli's sons, Samuel ministered before the Lord even as a child wearing a linen ephod. And then verse 21 says, the Lord visited Hannah so that she conceived and bore 3 sons and 2 daughters. Meanwhile, the child Samuel grew before the Lord. And starting in verse 22, we have another condemnation contrast with Eli's sons. And then down in verse 26, another, we talked about sandwich constructions in Mark, which they differ from this, but it's just interesting. We go back and forth, Samuel and Eli's sons. Verse 26, the child Samuel grew in stature and in favor both with the Lord and men. When you read that verse, I'm sure something came to mind. Luke chapter, 2, verse 52, where the almost identical wording is said about Jesus. Then following that statement there in verse 26, we have again more condemnation of Eli's sons and his whole family. And then chapter 3 gives us more Um, um, more positive things about Samuel, and then that's followed in a little bit later in the chapter with more condemnation. So we just see this continuing back and forth, this contrast. Um, Question number 11 says, did Samuel's parents lose touch with him after leaving him with Eli? And it says to explain. Well, verse 19 says, his mother used to make him a little robe and bring it to him year by year when she came up with her husband to offer the yearly sacrifice. It's uncertain as to whether this little robe was to be worn underneath his other clothing. Some think that it was probably a long outer garment like those worn by people of rank or special status. But it's really not certain. But that's not really the question. The question is, did they lose touch? And the answer is obvious there. It would be somewhat of a distance to travel depending on how far of a location that is. But nonetheless, they kept touch, and the mother showed a great deal of love for her child. Question number 12, describe the punishment which was to come upon the family of Eli. And it gives us a reference to 1 Kings chapter 2, verses 26 and 27. This is a section where a prophet, a man of God, comes to Eli and tells him what's going to happen to Eli and his family as a result of their disobedience before God. And verses 34 and 35, the man says, now this shall be a sign to you that will come upon you, on your two sons, on Hophni and Phinehas, and one day they shall die, both of them. Then I will raise up for myself a faithful priest who will do according to what is in my heart and in my mind. I will build him a sure house, and he will walk before my anointed, forever. Also, this is referenced when God speaks to Samuel in chapter 3, verses 11 through 13. Very similar language there. We see the fulfillment of that in 1 Kings chapter 2, verses 26 through 27. And it says, to Abiathar the priest, the king said, go back to your fields in Anathoth. You deserve to die, but I will put you to death now because you carried the ark of the sovereign Lord before my father David and shared all my father's hardships. So Solomon removed Abiathar from the priesthood of the Lord, fulfilling the word of the Lord had spoken at Shiloh about the house of Eli. We'll carry that forward into question number 13. It's related. It says, who were Hophni and Phinehas, and what would be the significance of their death? Well, these two individuals were identified in the very first verse it's verse 3 of chapter 1, where Elkanah would go to the tabernacle in Shiloh, and Eli is mentioned there, and both his sons are named. They're only identified as the sons of Eli after that, starting in verse 12 of chapter 2 until we get down to verse 34, and that's where we read their names. They were the sons of Eli, and it's interesting that they have Egyptian names. I'm not sure what significance that could be. I could surmise some things, but would have no proof of it. But the Hophni means tadpole, and Phinehas means Nubian or black one, which is a reference to Egyptian peoples. But what would be the significance of their death? Well, as we just read a moment ago, that they would die on the same day, and that would be a sign regarding the certainty of the prophecy of the man of God concerning the destruction of the priestly family of Eli. And that basically it would last for 3 more generations when you trace it out. Chapter 3, verses 1 through 9 will be the next section, and I'll pause so that you can read that if you want. It's the call of Samuel. Question number 14 says, why did Samuel not immediately recognize that it was God who was speaking to him? Well, this is that account that we're familiar with where Samuel goes and lies down, and Eli has laid, yeah, uh, and sorry, and and so God speaks to Samuel, and Samuel thinks it's Eli speaking, and we recall that account, and of course you just read it perhaps. Um, how is it that he did not immediately recognize it was God speaking to him? Well, obviously he'd never heard God speak before. That's addressed in the text when Eli talks to him. Perhaps he was even unaware of the possibility God had spoken to Eli through a prophet. We just saw in the latter part of chapter 2. We also find that in verse 1, the word of the Lord was rare in those days. There was no widespread revelation. So, again, it's likely that this had never been addressed before. Question number 15 says, since verse 1 states that revelation from God was rare in those days, do you have any idea why that would be the case? Well, the period of the judges, including the period including Eli's time, was around 350 years, and it was a period that was marked by political, moral decay, spiritual anarchy, and deterioration. It was not a good time, and so it's likely that the ungodliness of the people was the contributing factor to that. Question number 16 says, how does the latter part of verse 2 explain what follows? Latter part of verse 2. All of verse 2 says, it came to pass at that time while Eli was lying down in his place, and when his eyes had begun to grow so dim that he could not see, and before the lamp, and it goes on, verse 3, before the lamp of God went out in the tabernacle, and it continues. It's referencing that statement that his eyes had begun to grow so dim that he could not see. That's also mentioned in chapter 3, verse 15. Eli was 98 years old. His eyes were so dim that he could not see. My understanding, that being an explanation of what follows, I presume he's talking about the interaction between Samuel and Eli, Samuel trying to figure out why Eli is calling him. The fact that Eli's eyesight was failing him would perhaps explain why Samuel, this seems to be the reasoning, though I tend to question it. Samuel thought that Eli needed assistance because of his failing eyesight. I'm inclined to think Samuel would have behaved this way even if Eli had 20/20 vision, because he still didn't understand that it was the Lord calling him. But regardless, we move on to question number 17. It says, explain what is said about the lamp of God in light of Exodus 27 and Leviticus 24. I'll only refer to one of those verses because they're very similar, make the same point. Every evening olive oil was added to keep the lamps burning till morning, and the lamp would either grow dim or actually went out. But that seems to pose a problem with what we read in, for example, Exodus 27 verses 20 and 21. You shall command the children of Israel that they bring you pure oil of pressed olives for the light, to cause the lamp to burn continually. The King James Version says always, and I didn't recall exactly what some other translations said, but the idea that some take away from this is that it's never to go out. Verse 21 says, in the tabernacle, a meeting outside the veil, which is before the testimony, Aaron and his sons shall tend it from evening until morning before the Lord. It shall be a statute forever to their generations on behalf of the children of Israel. So I presume what he's talking about there is the indication in verse 3, before the lamp of God went out in the tabernacle of the Lord where the ark of God was, and while Samuel was lying down to sleep. Sorry, I hadn't read that. And so clearly says before the lamp of God went out, and Exodus 27 and again Leviticus 24 would seem to indicate perhaps that it never went out. But it's interesting when you do a search on the Hebrew word that's translated always there in the King James or continually in the New King James. Um, it's the same Hebrew word that's translated in a few other places as daily. For example, Numbers chapter 4 verse 15 and Numbers 29 verse 6, it's used regarding the daily meat offering and the daily burnt offering. The same word is translated daily 5 times in the book of Daniel regarding the daily sacrifice. Obviously, those animals were sacrificed or offered at one point in time, and it didn't continue nonstop until the next day, that same sacrifice. So it does not include the idea of the lack of cessation. Did I word that correctly? It does not mean that it never ends. It does not carry that idea with it, but that it's an ongoing, continual thing. Pause again for the next section, which is chapter 3, verses 10 through 18, if you'd like to read that. Question number 18 says, what is the announcement God made to Samuel? This is a repeat of what we saw from the prophet of God in chapter 2. We alluded to this, verses 11 through 13 specifically. And this is that God would bring judgment on the house of Eli because his sons had made themselves vile and he did not restrain them. Question number 19 says, why was Eli blamed for the sins of his sons even though he had warned them? Which that references chapter 2, verse 23 through 25. And it says, what else should he have done? Well, if these men were not his sons, I wonder if he would have treated them differently. In Deuteronomy chapter 21, verses 18 through 21, we're told how that parents are to handle a stubborn and rebellious son. I realize there are some distinctions there, but still they would clearly fall under that classification. And then in Leviticus chapter 10, we see God's attitude toward those who scoff at the position that they are in and are disdainful and rebellious, when we see how he treated Nadab and Abihu because of their flagrant disregard for his service. Question number 20 says, what did Eli's reaction to Samuel's disclosure of God's revelation to him show about his character? And then what did Samuel's faithful delivery of such a message reveal about him? Well, regarding Eli, in verse 18 of chapter 3, it says, Samuel told Eli everything, and he hid nothing from him. And then he, that would be Eli, said, it is the Lord, let him do what seems good to him. I suppose this could indicate a good attitude on Eli's part. I'm sure it could. I'm just not sure that it has to mean anything more than resolve or acceptance, realizing that it's the Lord. What can I do anyway? I simply have to. I don't mean to be cynical and critical. But I'm just not sure that has to be as positive about Eli as I've read others express. But you can let me know what you think about that. Then what did Samuel's faithful delivery of such a message reveal about him? It clearly shows that he had the courage to deliver the message of God faithfully, even when it was a hard message to hear. Stop for a moment again and I'll let you read chapter 3, verses 19 through chapter 4, the very first little portion of verse 1. These last 3 questions are pretty simple. Question number 21, how was God's presence with Samuel manifested? And what is the meaning of the phrase fall to the ground in verse 19? Both of those seem to come from verse 19. Samuel grew, we're told, and the Lord was with him, and let none of his words fall to the ground. So it seems that the presence of the Lord was manifested by not allowing any of the words of Samuel to fall to the ground. And what does that phrase mean? Well, another translation says, for example, the New Living Translation says, everything Samuel said proved to be reliable, came to pass, whatever phrase you want to use. Verse 20 is the reference for question number 22, says, what reputation did Samuel get? It says, verse 21, the Lord appeared again. I'm sorry, I said verse 20, didn't I? And all Israel from Dan to Beersheba knew that Samuel had been established as a prophet of the Lord, because God let none of his words fall to the ground. Dan to Beersheba is a reference from the northern extremity to the southern extremity, the far reaches of the whole nation, all the tribal territories. And so, what reputation did Samuel get? He was established as a prophet of God. Question number 23, where did God reveal himself to Samuel? Verse 21 tells us the Lord appeared again in Shiloh. For the Lord revealed himself to Samuel in Shiloh by the word of the Lord. In verse 4, chapter 4, verse 1a, the word of Samuel came to all Israel. That expresses his being established again. And so Samuel was established as a prophet. He was a priest, and he became ultimately known as the kingmaker, because he anointed the first two kings of Israel. We'll be doing lesson 2 next week, which covers chapters 4, 5, 6, and 7. Again, the material is on the front pew, or refer to a text or an email that I sent out about a week ago regarding materials online, and contact me if you need to.